Elias, the cemetery groundskeeper, had always prided himself on his resilience. For years he had walked these grounds day and night, ensuring the eternal resting place of countless souls was undisturbed. But tonight, something felt different. The air was unusually cold, the mist unusually thick, and a dog's persistent barking had rattled him for hours. At first he dismissed it. Stray dogs often wandered into the cemetery. They'd bark at shadows or dig half-heartedly at the earth before disappearing into the night. But this time the barking wouldn't stop. It wasn't the random yipping of a frightened animal either. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost desperate, as if the dog were trying to convey something. Finally, Elias decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Flashlight in hand, he trudged through the mist, following the sound. The beams from his light illuminated rows of headstones, their names long eroded by time. As he walked deeper into the graveyard, the barking grew louder, leading him to the oldest section of the cemetery, a forgotten corner filled with cracked headstones, overgrown weeds, and the eerie silence of history. There it was, a stray dog standing atop a neglected grave. Its fur was dirty and matted, its ribs visible under its coat, yet its eyes burned with an intensity Elias had never seen in an animal. The dog barked again, sharply, and then pawed at the ground. Elias hesitated. He shone his flashlight on the grave. The headstone was too worn to read, its epitaph eroded by decades of rain and neglect. But as he moved closer, he noticed something odd. The ground beneath the headstone appeared to have shifted. The soil looked disturbed, and a corner of wood, just barely visible, protruded from the earth. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Had a storm eroded this grave? Was it an old coffin, brought closer to the surface by time and weather? The dog barked again, now with an urgency that sent a chill down his spine. Elias stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold night air. The exposed wood was darkened with age, but it was unmistakably part of a coffin. A fresh wave of unease swept over him. Something wasn't right. He crouched down to get a better look. As his flashlight illuminated the exposed coffin, he felt his stomach twist. The dog had stopped barking and was now whining, pawing at the coffin as though begging Elias to do something. The silence pressed against him like a weight. And then he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from inside the coffin. Elias froze. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, faint, rhythmic, deliberate. His first instinct was to run, but the dog wouldn't let him. It barked sharply, growling and circling him as if to keep him from fleeing. With trembling hands, Elias turned off his flashlight and stepped back. He didn't want to see or hear any more. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't natural. The tapping continued, sending waves of terror through him. Each knock felt like a scream in the silence of the night. Mustering what little courage he had left, Elias fumbled for his phone and called the police. He stumbled through his explanation, barely able to articulate what he had found. But something in his voice convinced the dispatcher to send officers immediately. When Elias hung up, the dog sat down beside him, its gaze fixed on the coffin. Its demeanor had shifted. It seemed calmer now, as though it knew help was on the way. Elias could only wait in the cold, misty darkness, his thoughts racing. What was in that coffin? Who or what could possibly be making that noise? He glanced at the dog, whose eyes seemed almost human in their intensity. It let out a low growl, its ears twitching as the sound of sirens pierced the stillness. When the police arrived, their flashlights cut through the fog, casting stark beams across the neglected graves. 2 officers approached Elias, who stammered out his story. He pointed toward the coffin, still partially buried, and the officers exchanged skeptical glances. But when one of them leaned closer and heard the faint tapping for themselves, their skepticism evaporated. "What the hell is that?" one of the officers muttered, his face pale. No one had an answer. All they knew was that this grave, long forgotten and unmarked, held something that wasn't supposed to be there. The dog barked again, its tail wagging slightly as if urging them to act. The officers radioed for backup, requesting forensic experts and heavy equipment to fully exhume the coffin. The tapping stopped abruptly, as if whatever was inside had grown tired or had sensed the commotion above. The silence that followed was almost worse. Elias stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder if they were disturbing something best left alone. The dog sat beside him, its gaze fixed on the grave as if guarding its secrets. Whatever lay beneath the soil, Elias knew one thing for certain. This night was far from over. The police presence didn't do much to calm Elias's nerves. The officers were clearly unsettled themselves, though they tried to maintain a facade of professionalism. One of them, Officer Marquez, approached the coffin cautiously. She was the youngest among the group, and despite her attempts to hide it, her trembling hands betrayed her anxiety. As the forensic team arrived, they set up portable lights that bathed the scene in a harsh glow. The mist seemed to retreat momentarily, revealing the full scope of the grave's disrepair. The coffin, now exposed in its entirety, was in a disturbingly pristine state for something that had been buried for decades, perhaps even a century. The wood was dark and damp, but unbroken, its metal accents tarnished yet solid. It seemed as though time had merely brushed against it, leaving it untouched compared to the eroded graves around it. As they prepared to lift the coffin out of the ground, a peculiar odor filled the air. It wasn't the expected stench of decay or mildew, but something far stranger. It was sharp and metallic, almost like blood, mixed with an earthy dampness that clung to their nostrils. One of the forensic technicians paused, glancing at Marquez. "Smell that?" he asked, his voice hushed. Marquez nodded, her brow furrowing. She crouched closer to the coffin, her hand resting on her holster instinctively. "What the hell is this?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. It was then that everyone heard it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping. The sound was irregular, like a soft knock that seemed to echo from within the coffin itself. For a moment, everyone froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Marquez leaned in, pressing her ear closer to the wood, ignoring the part of her brain screaming at her to stop. It came again, tap, tap, tap. She stumbled back, her face pale. "There's something inside," she whispered, her voice shaky. The other officers exchanged looks that ranged from disbelief to outright fear. One of them laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Probably a rat," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or some air pockets causing vibrations." Marquez shook her head. "No, that's deliberate. That's not an accident." The stray dog growled softly, its hackles raised as it stared intently at the coffin. Its behavior only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Elias, standing a few feet away, felt as though the air itself had thickened. Every breath was heavy, every sound amplified. The lead forensic technician, a stern-looking man named Dr. Patel, signaled for the team to proceed. They secured the coffin with straps and carefully lifted it from the grave. The soil clung to the wood, reluctant to release its hold. The tapping stopped the moment the coffin was fully removed, plunging the scene into an eerie silence. Dr. Patel examined the coffin closely. He ran a gloved hand over the wood, frowning. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "This coffin is too well preserved for its age. It's like it was sealed against the elements, but why?" Marquez gestured toward the latch. "Can we open it? Whatever's inside, we need to know." Elias felt his stomach churn at the thought. He wanted to protest, to tell them that some things were better left undisturbed, but his voice failed him. He could only watch as the technicians prepared to pry the coffin open. As they worked, the metallic smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. Elias covered his nose with his sleeve, but it did little to help. The dog barked sharply again, startling everyone. It stood rigid, its gaze fixed on the coffin as if it were issuing a warning. Finally, the latch gave way with a loud creak. The moment stretched unbearably as Dr. Patel and his team lifted the lid, revealing the coffin's contents. Inside was a man. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and tight against his bones, but he was unnervingly intact. His clothes were old-fashioned, a dark suit that looked almost Victorian, but free from the decay one would expect from a body buried for decades. His hands were clasped tightly around a leather-bound notebook, and his mouth was slightly open, as though caught mid-scream. The sight sent a ripple of unease through the gathered crowd. Elias took an involuntary step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's face was frozen in an expression of terror, his hollow eyes shut tightly as though he had seen something unspeakable. Marquez was the first to break the silence. What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Patel leaned in, examining the body closely. "This isn't natural," he said, his tone grave. "The preservation is too perfect. It's as though he's been frozen in time." One of the technicians reached for the notebook, carefully prying it from the corpse's stiff hands. The leather was worn but intact, and the pages, though brittle, were legible. Marquez opened it cautiously, flipping through the entries. The handwriting was frantic, the words scrawled in uneven lines. The first few pages detailed mundane events, daily life, complaints about the weather, notes on business dealings. But as Marquez continued reading, the tone shifted. The entries became erratic, filled with paranoia and cryptic warnings. "They're watching me," one entry read. "They know what I've done. They'll bury me alive before they let the truth come out." Another page contained a crude drawing of a key, along with the words, "Esther holds the secret. Find her, and you'll understand." Marquez's hands trembled as she closed the notebook. "This isn't just some random grave," she said, her voice low. "This man, he was trying to tell us something." The dog barked again, louder this time, and then turned abruptly, running a short distance before stopping and looking back at the group. It barked again, its message clear. "Follow me." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. The dog seemed to know something they didn't. Reluctantly, he stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Whatever secrets this graveyard held, they were far from over. The moment the coffin's lid was lifted, the air seemed to change. A wave of the strange metallic odor poured out, heavier and more oppressive than before. The forensic team stood frozen for a beat, their expressions wavering between curiosity and dread as the corpse inside came fully into view. The body was unnatural in its state of preservation. Though the man's face was gaunt and pale, his skin showed none of the decomposition one would expect after decades underground. His hair, neatly combed, seemed untouched by the passage of time. His hands, skeletal yet intact, clutched the leather-bound notebook with a grip that suggested desperation, even in death. Officer Marquez swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the man's expression. His face was locked in a grimace, his mouth slightly ajar as if mid-scream. She shuddered, stepping back instinctively. "He looks like he died afraid," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the heavy silence that had settled. Dr. Patel leaned in carefully, his gloved hands inspecting the body. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Even under perfect conditions, a body wouldn't look like this after this much time. It's wrong." As the team stood over the open coffin, the dog let out a sudden sharp bark. The sound startled everyone, drawing their attention to the animal. It stood a few feet away, its tail stiff and its eyes locked on the grave, as if anticipating something more to come. Elias felt his stomach churn. The dog had led them to this grave for a reason, and he had the gnawing feeling that whatever that reason was, it wasn't over yet. Marquez reached for the notebook in the corpse's hands. The leather was stiff, its surface cracked, but the binding held. She carefully worked it free from the rigid grip, her movements slow and deliberate. As she opened the notebook, the group crowded around, eager to see its contents. The first few pages were ordinary enough, filled with neat handwriting and mundane details about daily life. The man, whose name they learned was Edward Grayson, had been a merchant in the mid-19th century. But as Marquez flipped further, the entries grew erratic. The handwriting became shaky, the lines uneven, the content increasingly paranoid. "They're after me," one passage read. "They've discovered what I know. They've promised silence, but I see their lies. They'll bury me before the truth sees the light." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Marquez continued reading, her hands trembling as she turned each page. One entry stood out, its words scrawled in large, frantic letters. "Esther. She is the key. If you find her, you'll understand. They won't silence us both." "Esther?" Elias repeated, the name unfamiliar. He looked at the historian who had been called to the scene, an elderly man named Mr. Callahan. "Do you know who that might be?" Callahan adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "Esther Grayson? Yes, she's buried here as well. Edward's wife. But her grave is far from here. The family plots were scattered when the cemetery expanded. If he's mentioning her, it must be important." The group fell silent, processing the implications. Whatever Edward Grayson had known, whatever had led to his burial in this strange, unnatural state, it seemed his wife held the key to understanding it. The stray dog barked again, this time running ahead a short distance before stopping to look back at the group. It wagged its tail once, as if urging them to follow. "We have to check her grave," Marquez said decisively, her voice breaking the tension. "If this notebook is right, then there's more to this." Dr. Patel frowned. "We're already deep into something we don't understand. Do you really think it's wise to disturb another grave?" Marquez met his gaze, her expression firm. "Wise? Probably not. But necessary? Yes. There's a reason this man was buried like this, and there's a reason that dog led us here tonight. Whatever this is, it's not over." Elias hesitated but nodded in agreement. The dog barked once more, then turned and trotted purposefully toward another section of the graveyard. With a mix of fear and determination, the group followed, their flashlights cutting through the mist as they ventured deeper into the cemetery. In the distance, a headstone loomed, its inscription barely legible under layers of moss and grime. This, they knew, was Esther's grave. What secrets it held, they could only imagine. The stray dog led the group with an uncanny precision, stopping only when it reached a grave nestled beneath a cluster of leaning, ancient trees. The headstone, weathered and cracked, was barely legible under the layers of moss. Marquez crouched down, brushing the surface with her gloved hand to reveal the name inscribed there. Esther Grayson. "Here it is," she said softly, glancing at the others. Elias, standing a few feet back, shifted nervously. The dog sat beside the grave, its eyes locked on the headstone, as though it knew the gravity of what they were about to uncover. Dr. Patel sighed heavily, inspecting the ground around the grave. "This headstone hasn't been disturbed in decades," he observed. "If there's something here, it's been waiting a long time." Marquez nodded and radioed for the excavation team to begin their work. The group stood in tense silence as the technicians carefully removed layers of earth. The process was slow and methodical, every shovel of dirt revealing more of the coffin beneath. Unlike Edward's coffin, Esther's was far more weathered. The wood was rotting, its edges crumbling as it was finally exposed to the open air. "Let's open it," Marquez said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. The team carefully pried open the lid, revealing what remained of Esther Grayson. Unlike her husband, her body had succumbed to time. Bones lay neatly arranged in the tattered remnants of her burial garments, but something immediately stood out. Clutched in her skeletal hands was a small, ornate chest. "What's that?" Elias asked, leaning closer despite his growing dread. Dr. Patel hesitated before reaching in to retrieve the chest. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, made of dark wood, and adorned with intricate metal inlays that matched the description of the key drawn in Edward's notebook. Patel examined it closely, his brow furrowing. "There's a lock," he said, holding the chest up to the light. This must be what Edward was referring to. Marquez opened the notebook again, flipping to the page with the drawing of the key. The resemblance was unmistakable. "This has to be it," she said. "But where's the key?" The group fell silent, and then all eyes turned to the dog. It barked once, wagging its tail and running a short distance away before stopping and looking back at them, as though urging them to follow yet again. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "This dog knows too much," muttered one of the forensic technicians, half joking, but clearly unnerved. Marquez ignored the comment and followed the dog. It led her to Edward's exposed grave, where his notebook had been discovered. The dog began pawing at the ground beside the coffin, its actions deliberate and purposeful. Taking the hint, Marquez motioned for the team to dig. After a few minutes of digging, one of the technicians unearthed a small metal object. Marquez's eyes widened as she took it into her hands. It was the key from the drawing, ornate and intricately carved, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. "This is it," she said, holding the key up for everyone to see. Her hand trembled slightly as she returned to Esther's grave, where Dr. Patel still held the chest. The group gathered around as Marquez inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, it resisted, the mechanism old and rusted from decades underground. But then, with a faint click, the lock released. The chest creaked open, revealing its contents. A bundle of yellowed papers bound together with a faded ribbon. Marquez unfolded the papers carefully, her breath catching as she read the first page. The handwriting was identical to Edward's entries in the notebook, but the contents were far more damning. They detailed a conspiracy involving a powerful family in Edward and Esther's time, one that had gone to great lengths to frame Edward for crimes he hadn't committed. The papers included evidence of forged documents, bribed officials, and even a signed confession implicating the family's patriarch. "This is it," Marquez whispered. "This is what he died for. He was trying to expose the truth." Dr. Patel frowned, his eyes scanning the papers. "This family he mentions, their descendants still live in this town," he said grimly. "If this gets out, it could ruin them." Elias shivered. He had no connection to the Graysons or their story, but standing there in the presence of these long-buried secrets, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The dog barked sharply again, drawing everyone's attention. Before anyone could speak, the sound of snapping twigs echoed through the graveyard. Marquez whipped her flashlight toward the noise, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. "You need to stop," the figure said, their voice low and cold. "You don't know what you're digging into." Marquez squared her shoulders, stepping forward. "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving the group shaken and more confused than ever. The dog growled low in its throat, standing protectively in front of the graves. Marquez looked at the chest, then at the papers in her hand. She knew this wasn't just about uncovering a historical injustice anymore. They had stirred something deeper, something dangerous, and whatever forces had silenced Edward and Esther Grayson might not be done with them yet. The group huddled together back at the cemetery's office, their breath heavy with tension as they pored over the newly unearthed papers. Marquez scanned each page carefully while the historian, Mr. Callahan, leaned in, muttering observations. The documents laid out a chilling tale. Edward Grayson, as it turned out, had been a successful merchant who uncovered corruption within a powerful local family, the Fairchilds. The evidence pointed to the family's involvement in embezzlement, fraud, and even murder. Edward had been preparing to expose them, but before he could, he was accused of treason, a fabricated charge designed to ruin him. Esther, loyal to her husband, had tried to hide his evidence after his death, but the Fairchild's influence had silenced her too. "They buried him alive," Callahan said, his voice shaking. "It's all here. They couldn't risk killing him outright and raising suspicion, So they orchestrated his trial and entombed him in that coffin, with no intention of ever letting him out. Marquez's grip tightened on the papers. And they left these records in her grave. She must have known someone would find them someday. The most chilling revelation came when Callahan flipped to the final page. It was a hastily scrawled warning from Esther. They watch still. Their heirs guard their legacy. If you found this, beware. They will come for you. Elias felt his chest tighten. So, that person who showed up earlier, could they be connected to the Fairchilds? Marquez nodded grimly. It's possible. If these people are still around, they won't let us walk away with this. The dog resting at Marquez's feet suddenly perked up, its ears twitching. It let out a low growl, staring at the door as if it sensed something. Marquez instinctively reached for her holstered weapon, her eyes narrowing. They already know, she said softly, dread creeping into her voice. We've stirred up something much bigger than we realized. As the group's tension grew, the stray dog barked sharply, breaking the silence and drawing all eyes to the office door. Elias instinctively stepped back, his heart racing. Marquez motioned for quiet, her hand hovering over her holstered weapon. The dog growled low, its teeth bared, and the atmosphere became almost suffocating. The door rattled lightly as if someone or something was testing the handle. Everyone froze. Marquez signaled to one of the officers who crept toward the door with a flashlight in hand. With a sudden burst, the door flew open, but the space outside was empty. Only mist and shadows greeted them. The dog bolted out, barking furiously into the darkness, and disappeared around the corner of the building. Stay here, Marquez ordered the group. She and another officer followed the dog, their flashlights cutting through the mist. Around the corner, the dog had stopped, pawing at the dirt in a small patch of untended land near an old stone wall. Marquez crouched down to inspect the spot and noticed something unusual. A small, rusted metal plate embedded in the ground. What is this? She muttered, brushing away the loose soil. The plate bore the same symbol as the one etched into the notebook and the chest, a swirling, intricate design that seemed to pulse faintly under her flashlight's beam. She called Elias and the others over. It's another marker, Callahan whispered. But why here? With the team's help, Marquez and Elias worked to pry the plate free. Beneath it was a narrow shaft, barely wide enough to fit a person, leading down into the earth. The faint metallic smell from Edward's coffin wafted up, making Elias gag. The dog stood at the edge of the shaft, wagging its tail and looking expectantly at Marquez. We need to see what's down there, she said, glancing at the group. Despite their unease, they nodded in agreement. Using a rope ladder provided by the excavation team, Marquez descended first, her flashlight illuminating damp earthen walls. The shaft led to a small chamber, carved out of stone, where she found another chest, larger this time with the same ornate carvings. Its lock was broken, the lid slightly ajar. Marquez's pulse quickened as she lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of old documents and a bundle of sealed letters. At the top was a journal, its cover stamped with the Fairchild family crest. She flipped through it, her face darkening as she skimmed the contents. This isn't just about Edward, she called up. This journal outlines the entire Fairchild dynasty's crimes. They've been covering up corruption, murders, and betrayals for over a century. If this gets out... Her voice trailed off as a noise echoed from the shaft above, a faint scraping sound like nails on stone. Hurry up, Elias yelled down, his voice tinged with panic. Someone's coming. Marquez grabbed as many documents as she could carry and began her ascent, her flashlight shaking as the noise grew louder. As she emerged from the shaft, the dog barked ferociously, its teeth bared at the shadows beyond the tree line. From the darkness, a voice called out, cold and menacing, "You shouldn't have done that." Marquez turned, her weapon drawn, as a figure stepped into the light. It was the same person from earlier, their face now visible. Sharp features, cold eyes, and an unmistakable resemblance to the Fairchild family portraits she'd just seen in the journal. "You've gone too far," the figure said, stepping closer. "Hand over the documents and we can forget this ever happened." Marquez stood firm, her weapon trained on the stranger. "Not a chance," she said. "These secrets die tonight." The dog barked sharply again, standing between Marquez and the figure like a guardian. In that moment, it became clear to everyone. This wasn't just about justice. It was about survival, and the truth had already taken on a life of its own. The air between Marquez and the Fairchild heir felt electric, crackling with unspoken threats. The group stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The dog, steadfast and unflinching, continued its low, guttural growl, its eyes locked on the stranger. Something about the animal's presence felt almost supernatural, as if it were more than just a stray caught in the middle of events. "I'm warning you," the heir said, taking another deliberate step forward. Their cold, piercing gaze swept over the group. "These documents don't belong to you. They're part of a legacy you can't begin to comprehend." Marquez tightened her grip on her weapon, her voice firm. "And that legacy is built on lies, corruption, and murder. I've seen enough tonight to know this needs to come to light." The stranger's eyes darkened, their expression shifting into something almost feral. "You've made a mistake," they hissed. "A mistake you won't walk away from." Before anyone could react, the dog lunged, barking and snapping at the air. The sudden movement startled everyone, and in the chaos, the stranger stumbled backward into the shadows. Marquez motioned for the group to retreat, shouting for everyone to move back toward the cemetery office. The dog, now snarling viciously, stood its ground, ensuring the stranger didn't follow. As the group scrambled through the mist, Elias tripped over a root and fell hard, the documents scattering from his arms. "Leave them," Marquez shouted, pulling him up. But Elias, shaking his head, quickly gathered the papers, muttering, "We can't let them win." They reached the office and slammed the door shut, locking it behind them. Outside, the dog's barking echoed faintly before fading into silence. The group stared at one another, breathless, their minds racing. Marquez peeked out the window, scanning the fog for any sign of the heir or the dog, but all she saw was emptiness. "Where's the dog?" Elias asked, his voice shaky. Marquez shook her head. "I don't know, but I think it bought us time." Mr. Callahan, still clutching the journal, spoke up. This isn't over. The Fairchilds won't stop until these documents are back in their hands. And that dog, I don't think it's just any dog." "What are you talking about?" Elias asked, his nerves frayed. Callahan hesitated before answering. "There are stories, old ones, about guardians tied to families or places of power, spirits or something else, watching over them. That dog knew too much. It led us to Edward's grave, then Esther's, and now this. It's as if it wanted us to find the truth." Marquez rubbed her temples, exhaustion setting in. "Guardian or not, we need to figure out our next move. We have enough here to expose the Fairchilds, but if they're willing to bury the truth this deep, they won't hesitate to come after us." Elias sat down heavily, clutching the bundle of papers like a lifeline. "If that dog hadn't been here, we never would have found any of this. It's almost like it knew we needed help." A loud crash interrupted their conversation. Something, or someone, was outside, rattling the office's back door. Marquez drew her weapon, signaling for silence. The group held their breath as the noise grew louder. The dog's bark suddenly rang out again, sharp and commanding, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. Marquez exhaled slowly. "It's still out there," she said, her tone a mix of relief and awe. "And it's protecting us." Elias nodded, his fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. Then maybe we're not alone in this after all. The group barely slept that night. The ominous warnings from the Fairchild heir, the documents detailing years of corruption, and the persistent presence of the mysterious dog weighed heavily on everyone. By dawn, Marquez decided they had no choice but to take the documents to a safe location and involve trusted authorities. But first, There was one final piece of the puzzle. Esther's grave still held secrets. The dog reappeared at sunrise, sitting by the cemetery office's entrance as though it had been guarding them all night. When Marquez opened the door, it stood, wagging its tail briefly before turning to trot toward Esther's grave once more. The message was clear. "I thought we already found everything there," Elias muttered, following reluctantly. His voice quivered, his exhaustion obvious. "Apparently not," Marquez replied, her hand brushing her weapon for reassurance. "If this dog's still leading us, there's more we need to see." They arrived at the grave, the morning mist hanging thick and cold around them. The disturbed soil from the previous night seemed untouched, as if the earth itself had settled back into place. The dog barked twice and began pawing at the side of the grave, slightly off-center from where Esther's coffin had been exhumed. "What now?" Elias asked, exasperated. Marquez waved for the team to start digging again. As they worked, they uncovered a stone slab embedded into the earth beneath the grave. The slab bore the same swirling design that adorned the key, the chest, and the Fairchild journal. It was a pattern that seemed to weave itself deeper into the story with every discovery. "Help me lift this," Marquez ordered, kneeling to grip the edge of the slab. With great effort, the group pried it open, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay an ancient chest, much like the first but larger and more ornate. "What the hell is this?" Elias whispered, leaning over to look inside. The dog barked again, sitting down as if to signal they were finally in the right place. Marquez reached into the compartment and lifted the chest carefully. The metallic scent wafted up again, making her nose wrinkle. The chest, though dusty, was pristine, its metal edges gleaming faintly. It bore an inscription in old script: "The truth shall bind the living and the dead." Using the same key as before, Marquez unlocked the chest. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside was a single item, an ancient locket. It gleamed unnaturally, as though untouched by time, and bore the initials EG on its front. Marquez picked it up and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of Edward and Esther Grayson, smiling, their hands intertwined. Why would this be hidden so deliberately? Callahan wondered aloud, his curiosity piqued. But Marquez noticed something else. A faint inscription inside the locket's lid. "For those who seek us, the past holds the answer." Marquez flipped the locket over, and as the sunlight caught its surface, a faint shimmer revealed a map etched into the metal. She turned to Callahan, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "It's not just a memento, it's a clue." The group studied the map closely. It seemed to depict an area within the cemetery, but didn't match any current layout. Callahan's eyes lit up as he pointed at a landmark. "This is the chapel, but it's older. The chapel was rebuilt 50 years ago." "Then whatever this map is pointing to must still be beneath it," Marquez deduced. As they turned to leave, the dog let out another sharp bark, drawing their attention to the tree line. The Fairchild heir stood there once again, shrouded in shadows, their cold expression filled with rage. "You've gone too far," they said, stepping forward. "You don't understand the forces you're meddling with." Marquez raised her weapon, her stance firm. "Stay where you are. This ends now." The heir sneered, their voice dripping with venom. "You think you're the first to try and expose us? You'll end up just like Edward and Esther, buried, forgotten, and silenced." Before Marquez could respond, the dog lunged at the heir again, forcing them back into the shadows. A scuffle ensued, the growls and yells echoing through the mist, but when the noise stopped, both the dog and the heir had vanished. Elias's voice broke the stunned silence. What just happened?" Marquez stared into the fog, her jaw tight. "I don't know, but we need to get to the chapel. Whatever's under there might be our only chance to finish this." With the locket in hand and the map leading the way, they hurried toward the cemetery's chapel, their every step shadowed by the weight of what they had uncovered. and the forces determined to stop them. The chapel stood tall at the center of the cemetery, its weathered stone facade bearing the scars of time. As the group approached, the dog was nowhere to be seen. Its sudden absence sent a ripple of unease through everyone, but Marquez pressed forward, clutching the locket tightly. The map etched into its back had led them here, and whatever truth it held was now within reach. Elias hesitated at the chapel's threshold. Are we sure about this? If that Fairchild heir really is watching us, we could be walking into a trap. Marquez's jaw tightened. We don't have a choice. This is bigger than us now. The group entered the dim chapel, the morning sunlight filtering through stained glass windows and casting fractured colors across the floor. The faint scent of incense lingered, a reminder of the funerals and prayers that had taken place here for decades. But their attention was drawn to the stone floor at the center of the room, where the map indicated something was hidden. Mr. Callahan knelt to examine the area. There's definitely something under here, he said, pointing to faint grooves between the stones. This floor isn't original. It's covering something older. With Marquez's help, the group began prying at the stones, lifting them one by one. It was backbreaking work, but their determination outweighed their fatigue. As the last stone was removed, they uncovered a trapdoor made of iron, its surface etched with the same swirling symbol that had appeared throughout their discoveries. Elias ran a hand over the rusted metal. This symbol, it's like it's following us. Marquez nodded grimly. It's the key to everything. Let's see what's down there. The trapdoor creaked loudly as they forced it open, revealing a dark stone staircase spiraling into the earth. A cold draft swept up from the depths, carrying with it the metallic scent they had come to dread. Marquez led the way, flashlight in hand, as the group descended cautiously. The walls were damp, the air heavy with the weight of centuries. At the bottom, they found themselves in a crypt-like chamber lined with stone shelves. But what drew their attention was the large wooden chest in the center of the room. It was bound with iron, and its lid bore a single inscription: "To silence the past is to chain the future." Marquez motioned for the group to stay back as she approached the chest. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of documents, ledgers, letters, and legal records, all bearing the Fairchild name. Each one told the same story: decades of corruption, manipulation, and murder, meticulously documented and hidden away. These are the records Edward must have known about, Marquez said, pulling out a thick folder. This isn't just one scandal. This is an entire dynasty built on lies. Callahan picked up a yellowed letter, his hands trembling. These go back over 100 years. Bribery, stolen lands, even entire families destroyed to protect the Fairchild's name. Elias looked around nervously. If this gets out, it'll destroy them. That's the point, Marquez replied, but they won't let us leave with this. Her words proved prophetic. A sudden noise echoed from above, the sound of heavy footsteps on the chapel floor. Marquez extinguished her flashlight, signaling for silence. The group huddled together in the dark, their hearts pounding as the footsteps grew louder. They're here, Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. The trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging them into pitch darkness. Panic set in as the group scrambled for their flashlights, the beams flickering wildly. From the top of the staircase came a familiar voice, cold and taunting. I warned you, the Fairchild heir called down. You should have left this buried. The sound of something heavy sliding across the floor above made Elias's stomach drop. They're sealing us in, he said, his voice cracking with fear. Marquez acted quickly, gathering as many documents as she could carry. We're not letting them win, she said fiercely. Elias, find another way out. There's always a way. The dog's bark rang out suddenly, sharp and clear, reverberating through the crypt. It came from somewhere deep within the chamber, as though it were urging them forward. Elias spotted a faint crack in the wall, barely visible in the dim light. Here, he shouted, grabbing a crowbar from his bag. The group worked furiously, prying at the stones. As they removed the last one, they uncovered a narrow tunnel leading into the earth. The dog's bark echoed again, guiding them toward safety. "This way," Marquez commanded, leading the group through the tunnel. The air grew colder as they crawled forward, the weight of the centuries-old conspiracy pressing down on them. Behind them, the sound of footsteps descended the staircase, followed by the heir's voice. "You can't hide. The Fairchilds always win." Marquez gritted her teeth, clutching the documents tightly. "Not this time," she muttered. The tunnel eventually opened into the woods beyond the cemetery, the group emerging breathless and shaken but alive. The dog stood waiting for them, its tail wagging slightly as if it knew they had succeeded. Marquez knelt beside it, running a hand over its matted fur. "You saved us," she said softly. The dog licked her hand before turning and disappearing into the trees, leaving them with the weight of their discovery, and the responsibility to see it through. Days later, Marquez handed the Fairchild documents to trusted journalists and authorities, ensuring the evidence was too widespread to be silenced. The revelations shook the town, exposing the Fairchild dynasty's crimes and forcing their powerful heirs into hiding. Elias returned to the cemetery, where he found the dog sitting silently near Edward and Esther's graves. It looked at him one last time before vanishing into the mist, leaving him with a sense of closure. Though the Fairchild's legacy was destroyed, the group knew their journey had been guided by something beyond understanding. Edward and Esther's truth had finally been freed, their voices no longer silenced by the weight of time. The past had spoken, and justice had been served.